Everything had seemed so ordinary. Nancy, my disabled daughter, was simply descending the stairs as she did every day, taking each step slowly and carefully. The morning was calm, like any other, with the usual hum of life flowing around us. But in a heartbeat, that calm was shattered. My heart raced as I watched her lose her balance, her body tilting dangerously, and in that moment I knew this wasn't just another fall. Something far more sinister was unfolding before my eyes. As Nancy's body tumbled down the stairs, time seemed to stretch, the fall feeling as if it would never end. The suddenness of it left me frozen for a split second, but panic quickly took over as I rushed toward her. My mind screamed for me to move faster, to reach her before the impact, but it was too late. Her fragile form collided with the ground with an unsettling thud, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I could hardly breathe. But it wasn't just the sight of her lying there, the pain and confusion clear on her face, that filled me with dread. It was the atmosphere in the room that shifted, cold, indifferent. The world around us paused, and in that stillness, I saw Karen standing at the top of the stairs. The very woman I had come to dread. She stood there, watching, with a blank, almost satisfied expression on her face, as if she had anticipated this moment. The words she spoke next were like ice, each syllable colder than the last. "She's careless. Always has been," Karen remarked, her voice so casual. It felt out of place in the midst of such a chaotic moment. My stomach churned as I looked at her. Karen, the same woman who had made life increasingly difficult for our family. The same woman who had never once offered help when Nancy struggled. The same woman who had a habit of making people feel small, insignificant. Now she was standing there, making it clear that in her eyes, Nancy's fall was no accident. She was blaming my daughter, a vulnerable young girl, for her own suffering. The words hung in the air, piercing the fragile silence like a cruel accusation. How could she do this? Why would she? I looked back at Nancy, who was trying to process the pain and confusion, her face contorted with both physical agony and emotional shock. She had always been so strong, so determined to live her life despite the challenges of her disability, but now she was being made to feel like the cause of her own downfall. A flood of anger rushed through me. How dare she? How could Karen turn something so traumatic into an opportunity to put the blame on my daughter? The tension in the room was thick. I could feel the eyes of the neighbors who had gathered around, staring in disbelief. Some were quietly watching, unsure of what to make of the situation, while others seemed to be reluctantly nodding along with Karen's words, as if they too had been conditioned to accept whatever she said without question. My heart pounded harder as I realized that in this moment the truth was slipping further away. I rushed to Nancy's side, my hands trembling as I tried to comfort her. The shock in her eyes was unbearable to see. She was already struggling with her disability, the physical pain from the fall, and now the cruel words of someone she barely knew were adding an emotional weight she didn't deserve. She looked up at me, searching for reassurance, but all I could offer was my presence, my silent promise to fight for her, to make sure the world saw her for the strong, beautiful soul she was, not the careless person Karen had painted her to be. But Karen wasn't finished. She continued to stand there, with her arms crossed, her gaze unwavering. If she had just been more careful, maybe this wouldn't have happened. "You should teach her to be more mindful," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. It was as if she was trying to manipulate the situation, to twist the narrative in a way that made Nancy appear at fault. There was no apology, no empathy, only an underlying sense of superiority that made my blood boil. I turned to face Karen, my anger rising. "You have no idea what you're talking about," I said, my voice firm, though the tremor of frustration was unmistakable. Nancy didn't deserve this, and neither does she deserve to be blamed for something she couldn't control. But Karen simply smirked, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling satisfaction. This wasn't just about the fall, this was personal. It was as if she had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike, to tear down the foundation of what we had built as a family. And in this moment, as I watched my daughter struggle and Karen continued her cruel tirade, I realized something far more frightening than the fall itself. This wasn't just about Nancy's injury. This was about Karen trying to break us. The room fell silent once again, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. The gravity of what was happening began to sink in. Nancy, the one who had always been the target of Karen's disdain, was now the victim of an even more insidious attack. As the crowd murmured in disbelief, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just a fall. This was the beginning of a battle, one that would test our strength, our resolve, and our ability to stand up for what was right, no matter how much the world tried to turn a blind eye. Karen was, by all accounts, the epitome of authority in our neighborhood. A self-appointed guardian of rules, she wore her position in the Homeowners Association, HOA, like a badge of honor. In the tight-knit community where appearances mattered more than anything, Karen was a familiar figure, a constant presence. She made it clear that the HOA's policies were not just guidelines to her, but strict commandments to be followed to the letter. She believed that maintaining order in the community was a sacred responsibility, one that could only be upheld through strict enforcement of the rules. Her role within the HOA wasn't just administrative. She had become the face of enforcement, and she had the power to make life difficult for anyone who didn't comply. It was well known that she was relentless when it came to what she considered violations. If a lawn wasn't perfectly manicured or if a mailbox was slightly off-center, Karen was there, clipboard in hand, ready to point out the infraction. She had an uncanny ability to find faults in the most insignificant details, and she wasn't shy about addressing them in front of everyone. Over the years, the neighborhood had come to tolerate Karen's presence. Some residents followed her rules without question, grateful for her guidance. Others, like us, couldn't help but feel that she had crossed a line. As much as she prided herself on being the enforcer of order, her methods often seemed less about keeping the peace and more about asserting her dominance. To her, compliance wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. And woe to anyone who dared to question her authority. Her reputation, however, was not one built on kindness or understanding. In fact, it was rooted in a certain level of cruelty, subtle at first, but growing more apparent over time. For someone like Karen, rules were never flexible. If you didn't comply, you were at the mercy of her judgment. There was no room for compromise, and while most neighbors kept their distance trying to avoid conflict, I couldn't help but feel that Karen's eyes were always on us, waiting for a reason to challenge us. The first time I truly noticed Karen's penchant for excessive rule enforcement was over something as trivial as our mailbox. We had just moved into the neighborhood, eager to start fresh, and I hadn't yet become accustomed to the unwritten rules that governed every aspect of life in the community. One afternoon, we received a notice from Karen pointing out that the position of our mailbox was a mere 2 inches out of alignment with the HOA's guidelines. The letter was polite, but firm, reminding us that such discrepancies could not be ignored. This was, after all, a community that valued uniformity. At first, I brushed it off. 2 inches? Surely, it wasn't that important. But over the next few weeks, it became clear that this was just the beginning. The very next month, we received another letter, this time about the height of our grass. We had just moved in, and the lawn wasn't exactly in perfect shape, but Karen, it seemed, couldn't tolerate even the slightest imperfection. Our lawn had been a few centimeters too high, and the letter was accompanied by a friendly reminder that the HOA guidelines dictated that grass be cut to a precise length. The frequency of these notices increased. Each one seemed more trivial than the last, but Karen was unwavering. There was no room for negotiation, no allowance for a little leeway. As the weeks passed, the petty criticisms started to wear on us. It felt like we were walking on eggshells, afraid that every little detail of our property might come under her scrutiny. The frustration was building, but there was nothing we could do. After all, she had the power to make life difficult. Karen was never alone in her enforcement. She had a team of loyal followers, other residents who had bought into her vision of a perfectly ordered, perfectly uniform community. They would accompany her when she conducted inspections, walking through the neighborhood with a sense of self-importance. Each of them would point out violations, no matter how small, and offer helpful suggestions for correction. It was as if they were all on a mission to enforce Karen's vision of perfection, and we were simply collateral damage. The real tension began when Karen started making comments about Nancy. She'd always been polite, even if somewhat distant, when interacting with us. But after a while, subtle remarks began to creep into her conversations. Some people just need extra space, she once said, glancing pointedly at Nancy as she struggled to maneuver through a tight area. It was a throwaway line, almost an afterthought, but it hit hard. It wasn't the first time I had heard such remarks. She had made similar comments about Nancy's disability in the past, each one wrapped in a thin veil of politeness, but the disdain was unmistakable. One afternoon, when Nancy was struggling to walk up the driveway with her crutches, Karen made a passing comment to a neighbor about how some people with disabilities just make things more difficult for everyone else. It was so casual, as if she truly believed it. It wasn't just a passing comment anymore, it was a pattern. And each time, it made my blood boil. She wasn't just criticizing our family's property anymore, she was subtly judging Nancy, making her feel like a burden, like her presence was an inconvenience. I began to realize that Karen wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was looking for reasons to disapprove of us. It was as though Nancy's disability, something completely outside of our control, was a personal affront to Karen's perfect world. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that Karen had been waiting for the right moment to lash out, to push us even further. It was clear she wasn't just concerned with the lawn or the mailbox anymore. She had an issue with Nancy, with us. Her passive-aggressive behavior towards Nancy escalated, and the little comments began to add up. It was no longer just about the mailbox or the lawn, it was about something much deeper, something far more troubling. I knew that Karen was capable of causing real harm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for an opportunity to strike. Little did I know that opportunity would come soon, and when it did, it would send shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. The morning had started like any other. The sun filtered through the windows, casting soft beams of light across the living room. And Nancy was, as usual, moving about carefully, making her way down the stairs. Every step she took was measured, deliberate. As if the very act of descending the staircase had become a challenge she faced each day with unyielding resolve. But today was different. Today, something was about to happen that would change everything. I was sitting in the kitchen, the sound of Nancy's footsteps on the stairs a familiar background to my morning routine. I didn't think twice as she started her descent. I trusted that she had it under control. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a foot slipping on the steps. Time seemed to slow. I turned just in time to see Nancy lose her balance, her body tipping forward as she reached for the railing, only to miss. My breath caught in my throat as her crutches slipped from under her, and she fell. It wasn't a slow tumble. It was fast, almost as if the staircase had become a giant, merciless slide that had no intention of letting her stop. I jumped from my seat, my heart pounding in my chest, but I was too far away. The world felt distant, the seconds stretching impossibly long as I scrambled her side. Nancy's body hit the stairs with a sickening thud, a sound that echoed through my ears even as I rushed toward her. I knelt beside her, panic rising in my chest. "Nancy, sweetheart, are you okay?" I whispered, my voice trembling as I gently touched her arm. But she wasn't responding immediately, her face contorted in pain, eyes wide with shock. I could see the fear in her eyes, the terror of being unable to control what was happening to her body. For a moment, everything around me went silent. All I could hear was the beating of my own heart as I struggled to process what had just happened. My mind raced, looking for any signs of serious injury. Her leg, the one she had always struggled with, seemed to be in an awkward position. I feared The worst, my hands shaking as I reached to check for bruising or any sign of broken bones. But Nancy's cry broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my stomach lurch. She was in pain, and there was nothing I could do to take that pain away. I felt utterly helpless. In the midst of the chaos, I heard footsteps approaching, heavy and deliberate, followed by a voice that made my blood run cold. "What's going on here?" It was Karen, of course, walking up the stairs with her usual air of superiority. She stopped at the top of the stairs and peered down, her eyes briefly flicking over Nancy's prone form. But instead of offering help or even concern, Karen's gaze lingered on us, calculating, assessing the situation with an almost detached interest. I looked up at her, fury welling in my chest. "Karen, this is none of your business." I snapped, feeling a surge of frustration. I didn't want her near Nancy, not now, not when my daughter was in pain, and certainly not when she had shown nothing but disdain for our family for so long. But Karen wasn't going to back down that easily. Instead of leaving, she took a few steps closer, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Well, someone should be keeping an eye on her," Karen said, her voice dripping with judgment. "It's clear she's not as careful as she should be. If she had been paying attention, this wouldn't have happened." I felt my anger rise. "What do you mean, if she had been paying attention?" "She's disabled, Karen. You have no idea how hard it is for her to do something as simple as walk down a set of stairs." My voice was shaking with emotion, but I refused to let her see how deeply her words were cutting me. Karen's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in her gaze. Was it satisfaction? Was she pleased by what she saw? I couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. "Well," Karen said, her voice cold, "maybe if she didn't struggle so much, she wouldn't have fallen. She's the one to blame for this." My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was blaming Nancy for her own fall, my disabled daughter, who had worked so hard every day to live a life as normal as possible. Karen, standing there, without a hint of empathy, making it clear that in her eyes Nancy's disability was something to be disregarded, something to be scorned. "I'll help you, Nancy," I said softly, turning my attention back to her, trying to reassure her, even as Karen's words echoed in my mind. I helped Nancy sit up slowly, brushing the hair away from her face as she winced in pain. The fall had shaken her, and I could see it in her eyes. Fear mixed with confusion, as if she couldn't understand why anyone would treat her this way. Karen was still watching, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You should be more careful next time," she added, as though it was somehow Nancy's fault that her body couldn't do what it once could. "We wouldn't want this to happen again, would we?" The words stung more than anything else she had said. Karen wasn't even pretending to care about Nancy's well-being anymore. To her, it was all about rules, about appearances, and about making sure that no one in the neighborhood caused any disruption to her so-called perfect world. As I helped Nancy to her feet, my blood boiled. This wasn't just about a fall, it was about something deeper, something more personal. And I knew, in that moment, that Karen wouldn't stop at just making cruel remarks. She would make sure that Nancy's fall became something we couldn't ignore, something that would drag us all into a battle we weren't prepared for. And I was ready to fight. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not now. Not ever. The shock of Nancy's fall hadn't yet subsided when the full weight of Karen's accusations hit. I could barely catch my breath as the reality of what had just happened set in. Nancy, still struggling to steady herself, looked up at me with eyes filled not just with pain, but with confusion. The world seemed to be spinning for her, and it broke my heart to see her so vulnerable. But what hurt even more was the way Karen's voice echoed in the silence of the room. She wasn't offering comfort or even an apology for her coldness. She was doubling down, and it felt like she was attacking us both. "You should really teach her to be more careful," Karen repeated, her tone condescending as she observed Nancy's shaky form from the top of the stairs. "If she weren't so reckless, this wouldn't have happened. A little attention goes a long way, doesn't it?" The words felt like daggers in my chest. How could she be so heartless? How could she accuse Nancy, My daughter, who fought every day just to be able to walk or climb stairs, of being reckless. Nancy wasn't careless. She was doing the best she could with a body that didn't always cooperate. I opened my mouth to defend her, but Karen was already walking away, as if she had said nothing wrong. "What are you doing?" I called after her, my voice trembling with anger. "You can't just accuse my daughter like that." But Karen, without even a backward glance, dismissed my words as if they didn't matter. "Maybe if you'd follow the rules around here, this wouldn't happen so often," she said, her voice trailing off as she walked down the hall, her footsteps echoing in the silence she had just left behind. I was left standing there, speechless, the air thick with her judgment. How could someone be so cruel? What had we done to deserve this? Nancy was still holding on to me, her face pale and full of pain. She wasn't crying, she rarely cried. Nancy was stronger than anyone gave her credit for, but I could see it in her eyes. She was devastated not just from the fall, but from the accusation that she was to blame. That somehow her disability was her fault, that she wasn't careful enough to avoid the fall. The words stung, and I could tell they were sinking deep into her, like a poison that would linger long after the physical pain had faded. I tried to console her, but nothing seemed to ease her mind. "Nancy, don't listen to her," I said gently, holding her close. "You're doing the best you can, and no one can take that away from you. What happened just now, it wasn't your fault." She nodded silently, but I could feel the weight of the shame she was carrying. It wasn't just the fall that hurt her. It was the idea that Karen and possibly the whole neighborhood might now view her as a burden. That feeling of being misunderstood, of being blamed for things outside her control, was too much for her to bear. I helped Nancy to the couch, where she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. The stillness between us was heavy, the silence deafening. But that silence was broken by the sound of murmurs coming from outside the house. Neighbors talking in hushed tones, probably sharing their own judgments about what had happened. It didn't take long for me to realize that Karen had done more than just accuse Nancy. She had started a narrative, one that could easily spread throughout the neighborhood. A narrative that would paint us in the worst possible light, all because we had a daughter with a disability who had the misfortune of falling. I walked to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly to get a glimpse of what was happening outside. There in the distance, I could see Karen talking to a few of the neighbors. Her hands were animated as she spoke, no doubt embellishing her version of events. I could almost hear her now, claiming that Nancy had been a danger to herself, that her lack of caution had caused the incident. Karen knew exactly how to manipulate the situation. She wasn't just spreading lies, she was systematically isolating us. In that moment, I realized that Karen wasn't just a bully, she was a master manipulator. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to end with just one accusation. She was going to make sure that our entire family was ostracized, that we were pushed to the margins of the community. She had found a weak spot, and she was exploiting it with precision. But I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let Nancy be the scapegoat for Karen's cruelty. I had to stand up for my daughter, no matter the cost. Over the next few hours, the situation only worsened. The phone rang off the hook with calls from concerned neighbors, some asking if Nancy was okay, others, those who had been swayed by Karen's words, accusing us of not being careful enough. Each call left me more exhausted, more defeated. The isolation I had feared was becoming a reality. It wasn't just Karen who was attacking us now, it was the whole neighborhood, or at least the ones who were willing to believe her lies. And it wasn't just the neighbors who were turning against us. Nancy could feel it too. As she sat quietly in the living room, I could see her withdrawal, the way she had retreated into herself. She wasn't the same vibrant girl who had walked down the stairs just a few days ago, excited about life. Now, she was quiet, withdrawn, and far too aware of the whispers around her. I sat beside her, trying to comfort her, but it felt like I was losing her to the weight of the world's judgment. "Nancy, you are not the problem here. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You are strong and you are loved. Never forget that." She nodded, but the distance between us felt vast. I couldn't protect her from everything, not from this. I couldn't shield her from the words that were now being used against her. And as the night wore on, I realized that this battle wasn't going to be won easily. Karen had started something that would be hard to stop, and the isolation we were feeling was only the beginning. But one thing was certain: I would fight for Nancy. I would stand by her side, and I would make sure that Karen's lies didn't define us. No matter how alone we felt, I knew that together we could face whatever came next. As the days passed, the tension in the neighborhood grew palpable. The rumors that Karen had started spread like wildfire. Each time I left the house, I could feel the judgmental stares, the hushed conversations behind closed doors. It became clear that Karen wasn't just a petty rule enforcer, she was a master manipulator capable of twisting the truth to fit her narrative. And the worst part? She had done it with such ease, with such calculated precision, that people were beginning to believe her lies. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen had been slowly building her empire of control over the neighborhood for years. She had positioned herself as the moral compass of the community, always willing to point out flaws and demand perfection. But the truth was, it wasn't just about the rules for her. It wasn't about maintaining order or keeping the neighborhood beautiful, as she often claimed. It was about power over the people around her. And she had found the perfect target in us, particularly Nancy. I began to think back to all the little incidents over the years, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now stood out in glaring hindsight. I remembered how Karen had always treated Nancy differently, as if her disability was a problem to be managed rather than a part of who she was. There was that time at the community meeting when Nancy had asked a simple question about an event, and Karen had cut her off with an impatient, almost disdainful look. "We don't have time for that right now," she had said, her tone dripping with condescension. Nancy had only been trying to be involved, to be part of the community, but Karen had made her feel invisible. It wasn't just that one instance, either. It was the way Karen had always seemed to single out Nancy in subtle ways: comments about her crutches, her need for extra space, even the way she had been treated during neighborhood gatherings. There was always an edge to Karen's words, as if Nancy's presence was an inconvenience, something to be tolerated rather than embraced. I also realized that Karen's disdain for our family wasn't new. She had always been critical of us, of our nonconformity. She didn't like that we didn't live by her standards. She didn't like that we didn't fit into the neat, tidy little box of perfection she had created in her mind. And now, with Nancy's fall, Karen had found the perfect opportunity to bring her hatred out into the open. It wasn't just about the accident, it was about punishing us for not adhering to her vision of what was acceptable. I spent the next few days digging deeper into Karen's background, speaking to neighbors who had been there longer than we had, trying to piece together the puzzle of who she really was. What I uncovered was shocking. Karen had been manipulating the HOA for years, using her position to bully residents and force compliance with her every demand. She wasn't just a stickler for rules, she was a tyrant, using the HOA as a weapon to control the lives of the people around her. And it wasn't just the trivial matters of lawn care or mailbox positions that she had been focused on. There were stories of her pushing out families who didn't conform to her rigid standards, using the HOA as a platform to make their lives miserable. The most disturbing revelation came when I spoke to one of the older residents, a woman named Mrs. Richardson, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She had seen Karen's rise to power firsthand. According to Mrs. Richardson, Karen had always been a troublemaker, but no one had taken her seriously until she managed to manipulate the HOA board into giving her more authority. Once she had that power, Karen's true nature began to emerge. She started by isolating residents who were difficult or non-compliant, in her eyes, slowly but surely eroding their sense of belonging in the community. It wasn't about the rules, it was about creating an environment where she could dominate, where she could make others feel small and insignificant. Karen had learned to play the game of power with a level of cunning that left no room for mercy. She knew exactly what to say, exactly how to manipulate people's perceptions, and exactly how to get her way without anyone questioning her. And now, with Nancy's fall, she was using the same tactics, spinning a story that painted us as irresponsible and negligent, while portraying herself as the concerned citizen, the voice of reason. It was brilliant in its simplicity, and it made me sick to my core. I began to realize that Karen wasn't just an ordinary bully. She was dangerous. She thrived on control, on making others feel inferior, on bending them to her will. And she had targeted Nancy, not just because of the fall, but because Nancy represented everything that Karen despised. Nancy was different, vulnerable in ways that Karen could never understand, and in Karen's twisted mind, that made her a threat. I knew I had to do something, something that would expose Karen for who she really was. I couldn't let her win. I couldn't let her manipulate the entire community into believing her lies. But I also knew that taking on Karen would not be easy. She had already turned so many people against us, and now it was my responsibility to make sure the truth came out. I started documenting everything, every conversation, every piece of evidence I could find that proved Karen's manipulative nature. I reached out to other residents who had been on the receiving end of her cruelty, gathering their stories. I wasn't just fighting for Nancy, I was fighting for our family, for the future of this neighborhood, and for the people who had been silenced by Karen's reign of terror. It was time for the truth to come out. Karen's power, built on lies and deceit, was about to crumble, and I was ready to bring her down no matter what it took. The fight had just begun, and I wasn't going to let Karen destroy us without a fight. It had been a few days since Nancy's fall, and the tension in the neighborhood was only growing. I could feel it in the air, whispers in the grocery store, sideways glances from the neighbors as I passed by. Karen's accusations had taken root, and now it seemed like half of the community was convinced that we were at fault. The isolation was unbearable, but I knew I couldn't just stand by and let it continue. Karen had pushed us too far, and now it was time for us to push back. The confrontation had been building for days. I had been gathering evidence, speaking with other residents, documenting everything Karen had said and done, but I knew it wasn't enough. I had to confront her directly, face to face, in front of the community. I wasn't just fighting for Nancy anymore. I was fighting for justice, for the truth to be heard, and for our family's dignity to be restored. The day of the confrontation arrived, and I knew it would be the turning point. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The plan was simple. We would meet at the next HOA meeting where Karen was scheduled to be present, and I would call her out for her behavior. But it wasn't just about the meeting, it was about reclaiming our space in this community, about making sure that Karen knew we weren't afraid of her. As the meeting started, I could already feel the tension in the room. The usual crowd was there, most of them silent, eyes downcast, unwilling to speak up against Karen. I could see the power she held over them, the way she commanded attention with just a few words. It made my stomach churn. But I wasn't going to let her intimidate me any longer. "Excuse me," I said, standing up in the middle of the meeting. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward me. My heart was pounding, but I stood tall. This was it. Karen looked up from her notes, her eyes narrowing as she recognized me. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was already preparing for whatever I was about to throw her way. She thought she had the upper hand. She thought she could control this situation, as she had so many others. But not this time. "I'd like to address some of the things that have been happening in this neighborhood," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Specifically, I'd like to talk about the accusations that have been made against my daughter, Nancy." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Karen's expression didn't change, but I could see the tension in her shoulders as she braced herself for what was coming. "You've made it clear," I continued, "that you believe Nancy's fall was her fault, that somehow she's responsible for her own injury. But what you didn't bother to consider, what you didn't bother to ask, was what really happened." I could feel the eyes of the room on me, some filled with curiosity, others with skepticism. But I wasn't about to back down now. I had the truth on my side, and that was all that mattered. I've spoken to neighbors, I said, my voice rising slightly. I've gathered evidence, and I've come to a realization. This isn't about a fall. This isn't about Nancy being careless. This is about you, Karen. This is about your need to control this neighborhood, to tear down anyone who doesn't fit into your perfect little vision of what this community should be. Karen's face flushed, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. She opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. You've used your position in the HOA to bully people for years, to push them around with your rules and your demands. And you've done it with one goal in mind, to make yourself the center of attention, to make yourself feel superior. Well, I'm here to tell you, Karen, that those days are over. The room was silent, but I could feel a shift. People were listening now. I wasn't just talking about my family anymore. I was talking about everyone who had been pushed around by Karen's manipulation, everyone who had been too afraid to speak up. I have evidence of the things you've done, I said, pulling out a folder from my bag and placing it on the table. Emails, letters, statements from residents who have been affected by your actions. You've used your power to control people, to isolate them, to make them feel worthless. And I'm not going to stand by and let you do it anymore. Karen's face had gone pale, and her hands were shaking slightly as she clenched the edge of the table. I could see the panic in her eyes, but I wasn't done yet. This isn't about a fall. This isn't about a mailbox or a lawn. This is about how you've used the HOA to make this community a place of fear, a place where people have to walk on eggshells just to avoid your wrath. Well, I'm done being afraid of you, Karen. And I'm done letting you make my daughter feel like she's less than. I turned to Nancy, who had been sitting quietly beside me. Her face was pale, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in days. Hope. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a fighter. Do you want to know what the real problem is? I asked, turning back to the room. The real problem is that Karen sees my daughter, and she sees weakness. She sees someone who is different, someone who doesn't fit into her perfect little world. And instead of showing compassion, instead of offering help, she's used that difference as a weapon. And that's something I won't allow anymore. The room was silent, but I could see the shift. Some of the neighbors who had been avoiding eye contact with me now looked up, their faces reflecting a mix of guilt and realization. It was clear that they knew what Karen had been doing all along, and it was clear that they were starting to see the truth. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand, cutting her off. I don't need to hear your excuses, Karen. You've had your chance to explain yourself. But now the truth is out, and it's time for this community to make a choice. Do we let you continue to control us with fear? Or do we stand up and say enough is enough? For the first time in a long time, the room was quiet, but it wasn't out of fear. It was out of respect. Respect for Nancy. Respect for our family. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. We weren't alone anymore. The truth had come to light, and Karen's reign of terror was over. As I looked around the room, I saw people beginning to speak up, to share their own stories of being manipulated by Karen. The floodgates had opened, and Karen was no longer the untouchable enforcer she had once been. She was just a bully, and it was time for her to face the consequences. I'm done, Karen muttered, standing up abruptly. You'll regret this. But I wasn't afraid anymore. No, Karen, I said, my voice steady. You will. The days following the confrontation at the HOA meeting were a whirlwind. The community, once divided by Karen's manipulation, began to slowly come together. People who had been afraid to speak out, afraid to challenge Karen, found the courage to stand up. The truth had been exposed, and the mask of authority that Karen had worn for so long was beginning to slip. But as satisfying as it was to see her control start to unravel, I knew this was only the beginning. I needed to understand how far Karen's influence stretched, how deeply her manipulation had taken root, and most importantly, I needed to expose her past. It wasn't enough to take her on in the present, to truly dismantle Karen's grip on the community, I needed to show everyone who she really was, who she had always been. So, I began digging deeper into her history. What I discovered shocked me to the core. The more I dug, the clearer it became. Karen had been this way for a long time. She had used her position in the HOA not just to enforce rules, but to control and manipulate. Over the years, she had built a network of people who either feared her or blindly followed her lead, enabling her to continue her reign unchecked. But this network wasn't built on genuine respect. It was built on intimidation, deceit, and a deep-seated need to control others. I began speaking to longtime residents, people who had lived in the neighborhood before we moved in. One conversation, in particular, stood out. Mrs. Richardson, the elderly woman I had spoken to before, had lived in the community for nearly 30 years. She had seen the neighborhood change, but she had also seen Karen's rise to power. Over a cup of tea in her living room, Mrs. Richardson told me things that made my blood run cold. Karen wasn't always this way. She began, her voice quiet and thoughtful. She used to be just another neighbor like the rest of us. But that all changed when she got involved with the HOA. She wasn't content with just following the rules. She wanted to make sure that everyone else followed them too, and not just for the sake of the neighborhood, but for her own sense of superiority. According to Mrs. Richardson, Karen had a knack for spotting vulnerable people, families who didn't know the ins and outs of the HOA, or individuals who had no idea what they were getting into when they moved into the neighborhood. Karen would strike up friendly conversations, pretending to be helpful, but then she would subtly begin to control the narrative. She would point out the smallest infractions, offering helpful advice that always seemed to benefit her in the long run. And if someone resisted, if they refused to comply with her version of the rules, she would find ways to make their lives difficult. It wasn't just about petty violations like grass length or mailbox placement. Karen had a more sinister agenda. She used her position in the HOA to drive families out who didn't conform to her ideal of what the neighborhood should be. She would spread rumors, make false complaints, and even call in favors from other HOA members to turn the community against those she wanted out. People who had once felt welcomed were suddenly isolated, cut off from the very community they had tried to be part of. It wasn't just about enforcing rules anymore, it was about power, control, and manipulation. One particularly disturbing story Mrs. Richardson shared was about a family who had lived next door to Karen years ago. They had a child with special needs, and Karen couldn't stand them. She made their lives hell, Mrs. Richardson told me. Every little thing they did was scrutinized. Their lawn wasn't perfect. Their fence wasn't painted to the HOA standards. Karen made sure everyone knew it. And when they finally couldn't take it anymore, they left. They moved out, and Karen got what she wanted. As I listened to Mrs. Richardson's story, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Karen wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was using the HOA to destroy people's lives, to push out those who didn't fit into her narrow vision of perfection. She had been doing this for years, slowly but surely turning the community into a place where fear ruled and conformity was rewarded. She had created a toxic environment where the threat of her disapproval was enough to make people bend to her will. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that Karen had been able to do this because people were too afraid to stand up to her. They were too afraid to challenge her authority, to question her motives. But that was changing now. The community had seen the truth, and they weren't going to let Karen's reign of terror continue unchecked. I knew that exposing Karen's past was the key to breaking her hold on the neighborhood. I wasn't just fighting for Nancy anymore. I was fighting for every family that had been pushed out, for every person who had been made to feel small or insignificant because they didn't fit into Karen's perfect little world. But I also knew that exposing Karen wouldn't be easy. She had spent years building up her facade, carefully crafting an image of herself as the righteous enforcer of order. I would need more than just words. I would need concrete evidence, something that would leave no room for doubt. So I continued to dig. I contacted former residents, spoke to people who had witnessed Karen's behavior firsthand. I pieced together a timeline of her actions, collecting testimonies from those who had suffered in silence for far too long. As I did, I could feel the weight of the task growing heavier. This wasn't just about proving Karen's guilt, it was about undoing the damage she had caused, about giving the community the truth they deserved. And then I found it. A set of documents, emails, meeting notes, and internal communications hidden in the HOA's archives. These documents revealed just how far Karen had gone to manipulate the HOA board, how she had used her influence to target vulnerable families and force them out. It was all there in black and white, proof of Karen's years of deceit and manipulation. With this evidence in hand, I knew the time had come to take the next step. It was time to confront Karen once and for all, to expose her for the manipulative, power-hungry person she truly was. The fight was far from over, but now I had the tools to make sure that Karen would no longer be able to control the community with her lies. I gathered my evidence, preparing for the final showdown. The truth was on our side, and I wasn't going to stop until Karen faced the consequences for the damage she had done. The community had suffered long enough, and it was time to reclaim the neighborhood from her grip. The war for justice was about to begin, and this time Karen wouldn't win. The final confrontation was inevitable. With the evidence I had gathered, carefully documented stories, emails, and testimonies from former residents, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. It was no longer just about Nancy's fall or Karen's hurtful words. It was about showing the world what Karen had been doing for years, how she had used her position of power in the HOA to manipulate, control, and intimidate anyone who dared to stand in her way. I had spent weeks preparing, making sure I had everything I needed to expose Karen. But now, it wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was about action. I knew that bringing Karen down would be no easy feat. She was formidable, ruthless, and had been controlling the HOA for far too long. But I had something she didn't, the truth. And that truth was going to destroy her carefully crafted facade. The meeting that had been scheduled was unlike any other. This was the moment when Karen would finally face the consequences for everything she had done. I had arranged for a town hall-style gathering, one where all the neighbors would be present. It was time to take the fight directly to her. This wasn't going to be a quiet conversation. It was going to be a spectacle, and Karen wouldn't be able to escape the truth. As the meeting began, Karen sat at the front, her usual confident, almost smug, demeanor in place. She probably thought she could easily dismiss whatever I had to say, that she could spin the situation in her favor, as she always had. But today was different. Today, she wasn't in control anymore. The room was filled with tension as I stood up, folder in hand. All eyes were on me, but I was prepared. The time for silence had passed. I had to speak not just for my family, but for everyone Karen had manipulated over the years. The stakes were higher than ever. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice steady, though my heart raced in my chest. I'm here today to tell you the truth. The truth about a woman who has used her position to harm this community for years. A woman who has manipulated the HOA, isolated families, and created an environment of fear and control. I turned to face Karen, and for the first time in a long while, I saw fear flicker in her eyes. She had been so confident, so sure that her position was untouchable, but now the tide was turning. The truth was finally being exposed, and there was no way she could hide from it. I've gathered evidence, I continued, evidence that shows Karen has been using the HOA as a tool to push people out of this neighborhood, families who didn't fit into her narrow vision of perfection. She's been bullying, manipulating, and lying to everyone around her for years. I looked at the crowd as I spoke, meeting the eyes of the people who had been too afraid to speak out before. They were listening now. They were starting to see Karen for who she really was. I took a deep breath and opened the folder. Here are the emails. I said, pulling out a set of documents, emails that show how Karen has used her power to target vulnerable families, how she has manipulated HOA board members to get what she wants. This isn't just about petty rule enforcement. This is about control. This is about power. I handed the documents to the nearest neighbor, who began passing them around the room. As the evidence spread, I could see the expressions on the faces of the neighbors change: shock, disbelief, and then, slowly, the realization that they had been duped for years. Karen's face was turning red. She opened her mouth to speak, but I wasn't done yet. I've spoken to the people who have suffered at her hands, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. I've heard their stories: families who were driven out, residents who were made to feel like they didn't belong, all because Karen wanted to control everything. And now it's time for her to face the consequences. The room was dead silent now. People were reading the emails, flipping through the pages, seeing for themselves the extent of Karen's manipulation. The damage was done. There was no way for her to deny it now. The truth had been laid bare, and it was impossible to ignore. I'm not just standing here for myself or my family, I said, turning to face the room once more. I'm standing here for everyone who's been hurt by Karen's lies, for every family who had to leave, for every person who was made to feel inferior, for every single person in this community who was silenced by fear. We're done being afraid. Karen opened her mouth again, but this time no words came out. She was sputtering, her anger rising, but there was no defense left. The room had turned against her, and she knew it. I will not let you continue to tear this community apart, Karen, I said, my voice unwavering. Your time is up. For a moment, the room was still, and then someone in the back spoke up. We're with you, they said. The voice was quiet at first, but it was quickly followed by others. More neighbors began speaking out, sharing their own experiences with Karen. The tide had turned, and the community was finally starting to stand up to her. Karen stood there, defeated, unable to say anything in response. Her reign of terror was over. The truth had won, and she had nowhere left to hide. The meeting ended, but the change in the room was palpable. People were talking to each other, sharing stories, and making plans to move forward together. The control that Karen had once held over everyone was gone, replaced by a newfound sense of unity and strength. But as I left the meeting, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The battle had been won, but the scars left by Karen's manipulation would take time to heal. The community was stronger now, but it would take effort to rebuild the trust that had been shattered by years of fear. As I walked out into the fresh air, I glanced back at the building where Karen's power had once been so absolute. It was over now. We had taken back what was ours, and I would make sure that Nancy and every other family in this neighborhood would never have to fear Karen again. The days after the confrontation felt like a breath of fresh air. The oppressive weight of Karen's manipulation had been lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the neighborhood seemed lighter, freer. People were starting to come together, no longer afraid to speak their minds or question the things they had been too scared to address before. Nancy, too, seemed to be finding some semblance of peace, her eyes brighter, the worry that had once consumed her slowly fading away. But while the resolution was bittersweet, I knew this wasn't the end of our journey. It was just the beginning of rebuilding what Karen had torn apart. In the weeks following the meeting, the neighborhood began to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. The support that had started in that tense room continued to grow. Neighbors who had previously kept their heads down, fearful of Karen's wrath, now openly discussed the changes that needed to be made to ensure the community could thrive without fear. Some residents took it upon themselves to reach out to those who had been isolated, offering apologies and support. Others worked together to revamp the HOA, ensuring it would no longer be a tool for manipulation but a space where everyone's voice could be heard. But for me, the focus remained on Nancy. For so long, I had watched as she internalized the cruel judgments Karen had cast upon her, feeling isolated and different in a world that so often made her feel small. The fall, though physical, was just a symptom of the emotional toll she had been carrying. The words Karen had used, careless, reckless, had seeped deep into her heart, and it would take time for her to truly believe she was worthy of love and respect just as she was. It was slow, but Nancy was healing. She began attending neighborhood gatherings again, not hiding in the background, but engaging with people, laughing, and showing the strength I always knew was there. She was no longer letting Karen's cruelty define her. She was taking back the power that had been stolen from her piece by piece, and it was beautiful to watch. For me, the most significant change came when I saw Nancy one afternoon sitting outside in the front yard, smiling as she chatted with a neighbor. There was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of the fear that had once held her back. She was part of the community again, not as someone who needed pity or help, but as an equal, strong, capable, and deserving of respect. I knew that the fight wasn't just about exposing Karen's lies, but about giving Nancy back her sense of worth, about showing her that she had a place in this world, no matter what anyone said. The resolution, however, wasn't just about us. It was about the community as a whole. Karen's reign of fear had isolated families, fractured friendships, and created an environment where people were afraid to stand up for what was right. But now, with her power diminished, the community was coming together. People who had been too scared to speak out before were finding their voices, and the HOA was being transformed into an organization that genuinely served the residents, not one person's personal agenda. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, we had a community meeting to address the changes that would need to take place in the HOA. For the first time in a long while, it wasn't just Karen at the front of the room. It was the entire neighborhood coming together to discuss what kind of community they wanted to build moving forward. People who had once been divided by fear were now united by a shared desire to create a space where everyone felt welcome, heard, and respected. The very foundation of the neighborhood was shifting, and I could see it. Hope had returned. But as the dust settled, I found myself reflecting on the journey. The battle against Karen had been hard, and in many ways, it was just the tip of the iceberg. Karen's manipulation had left deep scars on the neighborhood, on families, and on individuals. The work of rebuilding trust, of mending relationships would take time, but it was time that we were now ready to give. The most profound realization came when I saw how far Nancy had come in such a short time. The girl who had once felt like an outsider was now a force to be reckoned with. She was no longer hiding behind the walls of our home, afraid of being judged. She was engaging with the world, asserting herself, and reclaiming the life that had been taken from her. Nancy's strength, her resilience had always been there. I had always known she had it in her. But it was only when the weight of Karen's cruelty was lifted that she could finally stand tall. The scars would never fully fade, but they were no longer the defining feature of who Nancy was. She was so much more than the sum of her struggles, and as I watched her grow, I realized that this wasn't just my victory, it was hers, too. The neighborhood, for all its flaws, had become a place of healing. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to face, but the sense of community that had been broken by Karen's manipulation was beginning to return. People were reaching out to each other, offering help and support, and slowly but surely, trust was being rebuilt. Karen's departure from power marked the end of an era of fear, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter for the neighborhood, one that was rooted in mutual respect and understanding. As I sat with Nancy one evening, watching the sunset, I realized that the battle wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about reclaiming our lives, our dignity, and our place in the world. Karen had taken so much from us, but in the end, we had taken it all back. The power had always been ours. It was just a matter of realizing it. "I'm proud of you," I said to Nancy, my voice thick with emotion. "You've shown everyone what real strength looks like." She smiled, her eyes shining with something new. Hope, confidence, and a deep, unshakable belief in herself. "Thanks, Mom," she said softly. "We're stronger now, and we'll keep getting stronger." And with that, I knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where we were no longer the victims of someone else's cruelty, but the architects of our own future. The resolution wasn't just about bringing down Karen, it was about rebuilding a community where kindness, respect, and love were the true foundations. And that was a victory worth celebrating. The days following Karen's fall from power were full of change. The community, once held hostage by fear and manipulation, was slowly finding its way back to normalcy. Yet, as much as the immediate threat of Karen was gone, the echoes of her control lingered. The scars she had left on the neighborhood ran deep, and it would take time for trust to fully heal. However, one thing had become abundantly clear. The fight for Nancy's dignity, the struggle to reclaim our space in this world, had ignited something far bigger than just a personal victory. It had sparked a movement, one that could transform not just our neighborhood, but the way we viewed community and our role within it. The days grew warmer, and with the sun's light came a renewed sense of hope. It was almost surreal to step outside and not feel the weight of Karen's watchful gaze. The quiet that had settled over the neighborhood felt like the calm after a storm, a moment to breathe, a moment to rebuild. But as much as I wanted to believe that the worst was behind us, there was something unsettling about it all. Something that made me uneasy, as if the fight wasn't truly over. Nancy had made remarkable strides in her recovery. She was participating more in the community, walking with a newfound confidence, and reconnecting with people who had been too afraid to approach her. The darkness that had settled in her eyes after the fall was gone, replaced by a lightness I hadn't seen in months. She had transformed from the fragile, hurt young girl who had been made to feel like an outsider into a beacon of strength and resilience. It was awe-inspiring to witness, and I couldn't have been prouder of her. But as I watched her interact with our neighbors, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to be done. Karen's departure had cracked the facade of control that had gripped the community, but it hadn't completely shattered it. There were still whispers behind closed doors, still the remnants of her influence lingering in the minds of those who had allowed her to manipulate them. And while many of our neighbors had spoken out, had come forward to offer support, I knew the scars from Karen's reign would take time to fade. One evening, as I was sitting with Nancy on the porch, I glanced across the street and saw something that made my heart race. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as I looked closer, I saw that Karen was standing in front of her house, watching us. She wasn't alone. She had a group of people gathered around her, some of the same neighbors who had once backed her during the height of her power. They stood in silence, watching us from across the street, their faces unreadable. The unease I had been feeling crept back, creeping into the pit of my stomach. Was Karen plotting her next move? I turned to Nancy, who had also noticed the gathering. Her face was calm, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Don't worry," I said, my voice steady, though I couldn't completely suppress the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "We've already won. She can't hurt us anymore." But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't over. Karen had been defeated, yes, but the power she had once wielded was still a dangerous force. It was as if the community had been poisoned by her influence, and even though we had exposed her, the residue of her cruelty remained. Would this new chapter for the neighborhood truly be one of healing, or would it be overshadowed by Karen's lingering shadow? A few weeks later, I found out that Karen had made a move. She had quietly started a petition to reinstate her position in the HOA. It wasn't a surprise. Her need for control, her insatiable thirst for power, was too great to simply let go. She wasn't going to quietly accept her loss. She was plotting a comeback. And now, with her small group of loyal followers, she was attempting to rally support using her typical tactics of manipulation and intimidation. She was trying to rebuild her influence just as she had done before. It was in that moment, when the threat of Karen's return seemed imminent, that I realized something important. This wasn't just about one woman. It wasn't just about Karen or Nancy or me. This was about the community as a whole. We had won the battle, but the war for the soul of this neighborhood was far from over. The true test of our strength wasn't just about exposing Karen. It was about making sure her toxic influence never took root again. I knew that I couldn't let Karen rise again. Not for my family, not for Nancy, and certainly not for the other families who had been silenced by fear for so long. It was time to take action to come together with those who had supported us to ensure that Karen's manipulation could never take hold of this community again. We had to come together, not as victims, but as a united front, stronger and more determined than ever. The very next day, I rallied the support of the neighbors who had stood by us. We organized a meeting, one where everyone could speak freely, where we could discuss how to ensure Karen could never hold power over us again. It wasn't just about creating a fair and just HOA. It was about building a community where fear didn't have a place. A community where kindness, empathy, and unity were the guiding principles. We were going to create something stronger than any one person's influence. We were going to build a community where everyone was welcome, where no one was left to feel small. The petition to reinstate Karen's position was defeated before it even had a chance to gain momentum. With the support of the neighbors, we ensured that the HOA would be run fairly with transparency and accountability. We established clear guidelines, created an open-door policy for residents to voice their concerns, and set up a committee to oversee that no one person could ever have the power to manipulate others again. As Karen was pushed out of the HOA, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But this wasn't just a personal victory, it was a collective one. We had come together not just to fight for Nancy or for ourselves, but to protect the heart of our community. And in doing so, we had created something much stronger than Karen's power, a community built on trust, respect, and love. But as I sat on the porch that evening, looking at the community we had begun to rebuild, I couldn't help but wonder, was Karen truly gone for good? Or was this just the beginning of a new chapter? Would she find a way to rise again, to wreak havoc once more? I looked over at Nancy, who was sitting beside me, a soft smile on her face as she watched the sunset. She had come so far. We had both come so far. And no matter what happened next, I knew one thing for certain. We would face it together, stronger than ever before. The truth had set us free, and no one, not even Karen, could ever take that away from us.